Welcome to Insights from the Trenches, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of ADHD marriages and relationships. I am Alice, your host and a dedicated advocate for couples and individuals navigating the complexities of ADHD in their lives. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and join us on this journey. Together, we can turn the challenges of ADHD into opportunities for deeper connection and lasting love. Welcome to Insights from the Trenches. Let's get started. So, hi, Liliana. So glad to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey in the ADHD marriage.
Yes. Hi, Alice. As you said, my name is Liliana, and I am an ADHD life coach. And my journey started, let's say, 30 years ago when I met my husband. And back then we didn't know that he had ADHD. We have two beautiful young adult kids. Right now, both are diagnosed with ADHD and LD, learning disabilities. And and we've been married for 30 years now.
Wow. You've been married for 30 years. Like I said, it's a gold medal for you. That's a long time and you still marry. So congratulations there. Can you share what are those ups and downs that it has been for you, not knowing he has ADHD, and then when did you find out that he has ADHD?
Yeah, sure. So, it's been quite a ride. I mean, sometimes it feels like being on a roller coaster as tall as the Eiffel Tower with those, exhilarating highs and some like stomach dropping lows. But you know what? 30 years is a long time. And, we're still holding hands. We're still here. The truth is that every relationship needs work. And, the problem is that when you throw ADHD into the mix, I think that's when, we got a whole new level of complexity. It's not always easy, but it's definitely never boring.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm glad to hear you guys are still holding hands. That is a big accomplishment. Still finding love in the relationship after 30 years. So, with that said, what are the early signs that made you suspect that your husband had ADHD? And how did those signs affected the way you navigated your relationship in the early years?
Yeah, so the early years were awesome. Like we were in our 20s and life was all about adventure and fun. My husband's, spontaneity and energy were like a magnet. But then, fast forward a decade or so, and things got complicated. Like by then we had two children and a lot more responsibility and expectations. And my husband seemed very comfortable, right? Picking and choosing, his duties. It wasn't until my son started having challenges at school and got diagnosed with, LD, like learning disabilities and ADHD, that a light bulb went off. Suddenly, like I could see similar traits in my husband. It was like, whoa, wait a minute. This explains so much. It was kind of a relief, as by then we already, we were like stuck in that cycle of blame, frustration, withdrawal. And then we had an explanation. I mean, I had an explanation because it took him many years to consider the idea of adult ADHD.
You mentioned that it took him many, many years before your husband considered ADHD.
Yeah.
When was he diagnosed with ADHD?
Yeah, so he was diagnosed 2 years ago, right?
Wow.
And yeah, 2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, so
maybe you can walk us through a little bit of why did he decide to get diagnosed so late when you saw the signs earlier?
Well, I think what made him seek that diagnosis were about maybe 13 years of trying hard, seeing that there was a lot of love, but there was a lot of friction and difficulties, in our communication, in our relationship.
Mhm.
And I think he also went through very difficult experiences that made him pause. And by then, our two kids were diagnosed. So it was a little bit more of hitting really low and saying, okay, I need to do something. But I was very happy. I was really happy for him to finally get a diagnosis, right, and possible treatment.
Got
Because
it. Got it.
yeah, the situation was getting complicated. Let's put it that way.
Got it. So, how did that diagnosis change the way you understand the roller coaster ride of your marriage?
So as I said, for me, it was more about validation of what I expected, right? I think that I think it was more for him that it was like more like an explanation, a relation, and okay, there's something there that I can do, but
Mhm.
not for me. Right? Really, for me, was more about, oh, okay, let's say the white elephant, right, in the room.
Got it. That makes sense. Oof. So,
Hmm.
now looking back, what is the hardest period of your marriage in terms of dealing with the up and downs of ADHD? And how did you get through it?
Okay. So, those early teenage years with the kids were rough. And it's funny because the same dynamic that I believe saved our marriage almost killed it too. With my husband traveling for work half the time, we kind of run the show at home. Things were somehow organized, under control, they were consistent. But then when he was home, it was like living through an earthquake. I remember being so happy to see him, like every time that he came home, only for a few days later to feel guilty for wishing him to leave sooner. Honestly, it was hard. It was a period of intense emotions because he would interact with the kids for a little while. He would give me attention, obviously, and then behave like another teenager, right? Leaving a trail of mess, and helping with kids or chores around the house as he pleased. Like it was not his responsibility. He would promise to do things around the house, then turn around and do, something else or start a chore and never finish. He would get distracted and hyper focus on his hobbies and interests. I remember it was tough. I was constantly frustrated, right? I felt lonely. Plus, I thought the whole situation was unfair, right? And not fun at all. I mean, also for context, I was working. I was running my own business. So anyways, after many, many conversations, nagging became the norm, which not a recipe for success. There were a lot of questions and comments coming from my kids. And I felt like I had to pour oil on troubled waters most of the time. It was complicated to justify, my husband's behaviors to my children. When deep down, I knew him. And I knew he was more than his behaviors back then because he was undiagnosed. To your question, what helped me get through? I think looking back, I think it was protecting my kids and creating an environment for them, right? As predictable as, and consistent as possible. I think that's what helped me, get through. Yeah.
There were times that you thought you hit the lows, multiple times, and you just kind of said, why you wanted to stay. Is your kid kind of the key decisions on making you stay in the marriage, or were there other decisions involved that made you decide to continue and stay with the marriage?
Yeah. So there were definitely times when I thought about jumping off, this crazy ride. What kept me on? At first, it was a mix of love, fear, and honestly, confusion. But then, as I learned more about ADHD, I developed more empathy and compassion for my husband, even if he wasn't diagnosed, right? Don't forget, my kids were, diagnosed. So, it wasn't, because I knew it wasn't about lack of love or character flaw. It was about his brain, the way it was wired. So that shift, in perspective, helped me to keep learning more and have more realistic expectations. I think tolerance and different approaches to our conversations, that also, I would say, that was fundamental.
If you don't mind me digging in a little bit about empathy, because this is
Hmm.
always one that's really hard for non-ADHD partners, is when you're so angry, how do you find a way to find empathy?
Yeah.
To find that empathy so that you can find that compassion for this person, because a lot of times the ADHD partner is actually trying, just not to our
Yeah.
standard. So, how
Right.
did you go about finding the empathy for your husband when you're, upset?
Yeah, that's a good question. And and when I was upset, there was no, let me just be clear, there was no compassion. There was no, I was like, when upset, I like anybody else, you get emotionally hijacked. So there were many, many times where wrong thing was said, the door was slammed, went out for a walk. That ties back to the question that you asked me before, right? I mean, in terms of that, I wanted to, so many times, right? I wanted to still give up. I think that the empathy piece, right, and the compassion piece, it comes with the years. It comes after that emotional, the emotional hijack that happened. When reflecting back in my reaction, right? Because it's like wearing his shoes for a little while and understanding that it's not about not wanting to do something or not wanting to follow through on something, but it's about knowing what to do and yet not doing what you know that you ought to do, and not having necessarily the awareness. And I think that a big piece is education. The more I learn about ADHD, the more I learn what it means, what the symptoms are, and what it means about having and living with ADHD, having two kids and raising two kids with ADHD, being part of the community as well, right? And I think also making sure that I was putting, and I would say even now, right? Putting the oxygen mask on me first, having good support system, having self-care practices. It's like it helps. It helps with that idea of, okay, now that the situation kind of went back to normal or de-escalated a little bit, let's reflect, let's see, and doing my work and having conversations.
That totally makes sense, as that definitely happened to me. Because I think one of my biggest moments, I wrote about it quite a few times, is I was reading Susan Pinkey's book, and she
Mm.
was describing how hard it was for an ADHD individual to get up and shower in the morning because
Hmm.
her quote was basically, or she was describing that they could expand the entire days of energy just to go and get up and shower. And for us, it's nothing. It's so second nature. And until
Hmm.
that light bulb moment went up in my head, because I
Hmm.
realized, oh my God, I didn't know it was that hard because it's so second nature for me. And that was one of the ways that when you educate yourself, you read or however you do it, kind of help you develop that empathy. So
Absolutely. Yeah. The fact that it's like knowing, learning, yes, that the amount of mental energy that might take you to make a decision or put that habit, that the shower into your habit, into a habit, is a lot lower than it might take somebody with an interest based brain. That it takes, the person knows the importance of taking the shower, but it's the thought of, it feels so difficult. It feels so like, oh my God, how do I get that? Until, I know it sounds silly, but they are just different wires. It's different ways that the brains are wired. And on the other hand, right, I mean, the flip side, it's like somebody with ADHD might have a lot of energy. It might be, impulsive. But the flip side is being someone with lots of energy, zest, and creativity that a neurotypical might not have, right? So it's about seeing the person as a whole, seeing the person as beyond the ADHD piece, and especially because it's invisible. So it's harder when we cannot grasp the idea of what it is. We only see
yeah,
behaviors. We only see unwanted behaviors as a result.
that is true. Or I think sometimes people don't see don't see it, and they just think, oh, this is just a normal person, versus really seeing that these ADHD symptoms can actually create this invisible disability that people just overlook it. I think from my perspective, because it just
Yeah,
looks so normal. Why can't he just be or she can't be one of us? Versus thinking, oh, there are challenges they go through. There are some there are different chemistry that's going on in their brain that makes them a certain
mhm,
way. Doesn't make them bad, but it's going to create challenges for them. So
right. Yes, it's exactly, yes, because in one way or another, ADHD, it's like they're affected, like they're affected by executive functions, right? So they do have executive functions challenges, and so it's all invisible. So we say, oh, why can't you do XYZ, right? If there is no interest. But then again, we are judging most of the time that behavior, the way that translates, because it translates into behavior. And so then there is expectations. It's complicated. So, and especially when we're talking about, especially in my case, right, for me, with that period of having the kids since they were, let's say, kids all the way to young adults, really, or late teens, right? Because there's a lot going on, and both parents, they work. There's a lot of going on in the house. There's a lot of responsibilities, and then your spouse has ADHD, and that's the problem, because the person who is an individual with ADHD, it's not that we don't see that, but they know that they should be doing something. But it's again that to initiate that task, to take that, to create a momentum, sometimes it's exhausting, and they don't know if they are undiagnosed. It's even more difficult because they don't know how to do it, but they know that they should be doing. So it's hard on them too.
no, that makes sense. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. Let's talk about when you look back at the different stages in your marriage, from your early years to your 30s, 40s, and your now 50s. How did the roller coaster shift over time? And what were the different challenges? And when did you actually start learning to manage the ride better?
Mhm. So relationships, they evolve, and so do the partners. I think that ADHD adds a unique layer of complexity to relationships, and yes, creates specific challenges that most of the time are related to executive function. But it also creates learning opportunities. After all, Alice, I mean, we are all a mix of good stuff and not so good stuff, ADHD or not. I think in terms of looking back, it's fair to say that my coping mechanisms in my 30s were a lot more maladaptive than the current ones. Because like nowadays, there is a lot more clear communication, there is respect, and there is ownership. Well, maybe also I have to, maybe also there is a natural consequence, right? I mean, a natural shift that happens as we grow older.
So here's another question for you. How did you adapt your coping mechanism to match the needs of your relationship as you both grow older? And can you give us an example?
Being caught up in that, like symptom response dynamic was one of those coping mechanisms that really was maladaptive, right? That was not really helpful because it didn't take us anywhere. And having that hidden agenda of I'm the competent one and you are the incompetent also didn't add much for as a coping mechanism. I think that compared to now, we have more open communication, and he knows my needs, and we talk so many times about boundaries. It's not my responsibility I'm not responsible for him in that way. So it's about he takes ownership of what he needs to do, his schedules, and and he will face his own consequences. From my side also, it's like stepping back and coming from that point of validating that there's many different ways of doing the same thing. So I think that before there was a lot more, you wrong, I'm right. You're so immature, I'm so mature. It was more about what's wrong with you. It was about deficit, and discounting everything that he will bring into the relationship, the amazing human being he is, the great, amazing father, the fun that he is. As opposed to now, it's more about validating, it's more about pointing out, it's recognizing. It is also, hey, those are my needs. This is what I need. Can you provide? Well, if you cannot provide fully, then maybe I can also provide some of my needs with my friends or different kinds of support systems that I have. There is more a collaborative, right, approach than deficit against like deficit or surplus. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Understanding your boundaries and communicating those boundaries are really front and center because it's a way to be yourself and to let the other person know what you need in order to have a happy relationship. Because if someone keeps crossing the boundaries, it's not going to make you happy. So I completely agree with what you said. And creating that supportive environment is also very critical too. I really believe in what you're saying, where owning your boundary, being able to communicate it, and then building yourself a supportive environment, and then to provide what you need is super critical to sustaining a happy marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it was about choosing also to prioritize my children and motherhood. I really wanted to create the most fulfilling experience for me and them. And I also had my own business to run, and my support system, my friends, and lots of self-care practices.
Oh, that's good to know. That's good to know. How did you approach your husband with these conversations? Like talking about boundaries. I think that's an interesting one to share with the audience.
Well, for years, our conversations, they hit a brick wall of defensiveness and frustration. Looking back, I can see that for a long time, as I said earlier, right, I had this hidden agenda, right, of proving him wrong, that I was a competent one. And it's like, I can't tell you how many times I tried to address the elephant in the room with us going in circles, both feeling hurt and, misunderstood. But after his diagnosis, right, he started medication. And that's when things took a turn for the better. Honestly, it was like day and night for us. He helped us break that, symptom response dynamic that is so, well known, right? So I think that was for us, at least, that was very, very important.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I would agree with you too, because it was a medication that improved his behavior because he was more focused in my situation. And then that allow us to have those conversations. Because without the medication, it was hard to have those conversations. It doesn't have the ability to sustain that focus. And the medication helps them. And then we can actually have more challenging conversation. And he was able to stay in focus too, which was very helpful. So I'm glad to hear that you were experiencing the same thing and how medication really helped you in your situation.
In my situation, I would even say that the shame piece, I think it was big. We're talking about like he over 20 something years undiagnosed. And so, and again, it's not about lack of love. From his perspective, trying so hard to contribute and to please me and to fulfill my needs. And it's like he speaks Greek and I was speaking Portuguese, right? So there was no communication. I wanted to talk about it and he didn't. He wanted to problem, solving kind of approach. And there was a lot of disconnection. So I think that medication, what it did for him, it was about, again, right, working on the, bringing that balance, right, the chemical balance in the brain. So he was more tolerant. He was more, he had more, as you said, right, focus, but also self-regulated. So he was able to stay more self-regulated and divorce a little bit from that shame because it's constantly there. Again, having ADHD is not about not knowing what to do, but it's not doing what you know that you should do, that you ought to do. So that creates a lot of pain, creates a lot of shame, guilt. It can come out, can be translated so many different ways. It was a turning point for sure.
Given what you said about medication, I'm wondering, and you have to tell me, if there's one thing you wish you would have known earlier in your marriage that could help you navigate your relationship better, what would it be?
That he has that he has an interest-based attention system, whereas mine is wired for importance. I think he might have made the whole difference in the world. Again, right? We come from very different very different attention systems, right? And
Mhm.
so if I knew that, I'm sure that, might have made a difference.
So, for many non ADHD partners out there that are still struggling and feeling like the roller coaster ride never ending for them, what advice would you give them about managing those emotional highs and lows over the long term?
So I think perseverance, patience, love, and a good dose of humor are super important. Also, what really helps me is having a practice of connecting with what made me fall in love with my partner in the first place. That for me, it's like key.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you answering all our questions.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure.